The warm summer night in Nashville wrapped around Staff Sergeant James Connor like a familiar blanket as he stepped out of the elevator onto the rooftop bar of the Highland Hotel. It was just past 8 o'clock p.m., and the city lights were beginning to twinkle against the darkening sky. Connor hadn't planned on going out that night, or any night during his 2-week leave from Afghanistan, but the walls of his hotel room had started closing in on him after too many hours alone with his thoughts. 6 months in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan had changed him in ways that his family back home couldn't understand. That's why he'd chosen to spend his leave in Nashville instead of returning to his hometown in Ohio. Here, he could be anonymous, just another face in the crowd, seeking peace in the gentle Tennessee evening. The Highlands Rooftop Bar offered exactly what he needed: fresh air, a good view, and the promise of a quiet drink. The space was tastefully decorated with string lights that hung overhead like fallen stars, and comfortable seating areas were scattered around the open-air venue. Several small groups of people chatted quietly at their tables, their conversations creating a soft background hum that Connor found soothing. He made his way to the bar, his military training unconsciously kicking in as he surveyed the space. 2 exits, the elevator he'd come up in, and a stairwell door marked "Emergency Exit Only." 12 civilians present, mostly couples and small groups of friends. One bartender, a young woman with auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, probably in her mid-20s. His situational awareness was so deeply ingrained that these observations came automatically, like breathing. "What can I get you?" the bartender asked with a warm smile as Connor settled onto a bar stool. Her name tag read Sarah. "Whiskey. Neat," Connor replied, his voice carrying the slight roughness of someone who hadn't spoken much lately. "Whatever local bourbon you'd recommend." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Try the Belle Meade Reserve. It's one of Nashville's finest." She reached for a bottle and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. Connor took a small sip, appreciating the smooth burn and rich flavor. It was better than the cheap stuff they sometimes managed to get their hands on during deployment. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the peaceful atmosphere wash over him. The sound came first, a deep rumble from the street below that made the glasses behind the bar vibrate slightly. Connor's muscles tensed instinctively, his body reacting to the noise before his mind could process it. But this wasn't the sound of incoming artillery or distant explosions. It was motorcycles, 3 of them, by his count, their engines echoing off the downtown buildings. A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and Connor's peaceful evening began to unravel. 3 men stepped onto the rooftop, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden deck. Their leather vests identified them as members of the Steel Knights Motorcycle Club, though Connor could tell from their patches and behavior that they weren't military veterans like many legitimate bike club members. These men were playing at being tough guys, their vests covered in patches they hadn't earned and phrases that were meant to intimidate rather than represent real brotherhood. The leader of the trio was a large man with a gray-streaked beard and arms covered in faded tattoos. His vest had TNK embroidered across the back in bold letters, and he carried himself with the exaggerated swagger of someone used to intimidating others with his size alone. His 2 companions were smaller but had the same aggressive energy, their eyes scanning the rooftop like predators looking for prey. The atmosphere on the rooftop changed immediately. Conversations quieted, and several patrons began gathering their belongings, sensing the potential for trouble. Sarah's smile disappeared as she watched the bikers approach the bar, her hands busy wiping down an already clean glass, a nervous habit Connor had noticed in many bartenders over the years. Connor took another sip of his whiskey, keeping his body language neutral and relaxed despite his heightened awareness. He'd seen enough trouble in Afghanistan to last a lifetime. He wasn't looking for any more. But as Tank and his friends settled at the bar a few seats down, ordering beers in loud, demanding voices, Connor couldn't shake the feeling that trouble had come looking for him anyway. The peaceful rooftop sanctuary was about to become a battlefield of a different kind, and Staff Sergeant James Connor found himself automatically shifting into the mindset that had kept him and his team alive through countless missions. Sometimes, he reflected, you don't choose the moment chooses you. Tank and his 2 friends had been at the rooftop bar for less than 15 minutes, but they'd already managed to make everyone uncomfortable. Connor watched from his spot at the bar as they ordered their 4th round of beers, their voices getting louder with each drink. Sarah, the bartender, kept her professional smile in place, but Connor could see the way her hands shook slightly as she opened each bottle. The night had grown darker, and the string lights overhead cast shadows across the rooftop. Most of the other customers had already left, not wanting to deal with the increasingly rowdy bikers. Only a few remained. A businessman in an expensive suit trying to finish his drink quickly, a young couple in the corner who seemed unsure whether to leave or stay, and Connor, who continued to observe everything while appearing to focus only on his whiskey. "Hey, sweetheart." Tank called out to Sarah, his voice carrying that dangerous edge that Connor had heard too many times before. The sound of a man looking to cause trouble. "Why don't you come over here and talk to some real men?" His two friends laughed, encouraging him. Sarah pretended not to hear, busying herself with wiping down the bar near Connor. He could smell her fear. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the subtle kind that comes from being trapped in a bad situation with no easy way out. Connor knew that smell well from his time in combat zones, where civilians often wore the same expression Sarah had now. The businessman finally gathered his courage to leave, standing up from his table. As he walked past the bikers, Tank deliberately stuck out his boot, causing the man to stumble. The businessman's half-full glass went flying, chattering on the wooden deck. "Watch where you're going, suit." Tank laughed, high-fiving one of his friends. The businessman hurried to the elevator without looking back, his face red with anger and embarrassment. Sarah moved to clean up the broken glass, but Connor gently touched her arm. "Let them do it," he said quietly. "It's their mess." His voice was calm, but carried enough authority that Sarah nodded and stayed behind the bar. "Hey," Tank shouted, having noticed the exchange. "You got something to say, boy?" He turned his bar stool to face Connor fully, his body language aggressive and challenging. Connor took another slow sip of his whiskey, his movements deliberate and controlled. He didn't respond to Tank's question, which seemed to anger the biker even more. Connor's silence was not born of fear. It came from years of experience knowing that men like Tank were looking for any excuse to escalate the situation. The young couple in the corner finally decided to leave, quickly making their way to the elevator. As they passed, one of Tank's friends, a skinny man with a snake tattoo on his neck, made a crude comment about the young woman. Her boyfriend pulled her closer and walked faster, refusing to engage. Sarah tried to maintain some control over the situation. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice professional but firm, "I think you've had enough for tonight. I'll need to close out your tab." Snake Tattoo reached across the bar and grabbed Sarah's wrist. "We'll tell you when we've had enough, princess." His grip was tight enough to make Sarah wince in pain. Connor felt a familiar sensation wash over him, a calm clarity that always preceded action. In Afghanistan, this feeling had saved his life and the lives of his team members countless times. It was the moment when training took over, when the noise of the world fell away and left only crystal clear purpose. He noticed every detail with sharp precision. Wei Tank's right hand was drifting toward his vest pocket, probably reaching for a knife. How the third biker, a heavy-set man with a shaved head, was shifting his weight to block the path to the elevator, the distance to the emergency exit, the potential weapons within reach, bottles, bar stools, the heavy flashlight under the bar that Sarah kept for power outages. Most importantly, Connor saw the fear in Sarah's eyes. The same fear he'd seen in the eyes of civilians caught in war zones, people who needed protection from those who had harmed them. In that moment, Staff Sergeant James Connor knew that his peaceful evening was over. He hadn't come looking for a fight, but he'd never been one to walk away when the innocent needed help. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and everyone on that rooftop knew that something was about to break. The only question was who would make the first move. Time seemed to slow down as Connor watched Snake Tattoo's fingers tighten around Sarah's wrist. The bartender's face had gone pale, and Connor could see tears forming in her eyes. It wasn't just pain. It was the helpless anger that comes from being bullied by someone bigger and stronger than you. Connor had seen that look too many times during his tours of duty, and he'd sworn an oath to protect people from exactly this kind of situation. "Let her go," Connor said quietly, his voice carrying across the now silent rooftop. The music playing through the speakers seemed to fade into the background, as if even the sound system knew something important was about to happen. Snake Tattoo turned his head slowly, still gripping Sarah's wrist. "Mind your own business, friend," he sneered, but Connor could see the first flicker of uncertainty in the man's eyes. Something in Connor's tone had gotten through, a hint of the authority that came from real experience rather than practiced intimidation. Tank stood up from his bar stool, trying to use his height to look down at Connor. At 6'2" and 240 pounds, Tank was used to being the biggest man in the room, but Connor didn't seem impressed. The soldier remained seated, his posture relaxed but alert, like a coiled spring waiting to be released. "Maybe you need a lesson in minding your own business," Tank growled, moving closer to Connor. The third biker, whom the others called Diesel, spread out to the side, trying to surround Connor at his seat. Connor's military training kicked in automatically. In his mind, he was already mapping out the next 30 seconds. Snake Tattoo was the immediate threat to the civilian, Sarah. Tank was the primary aggressor, and Diesel was attempting a flanking maneuver. It was like countless combat scenarios he trained for, just with different players. "Last chance," Connor said, his voice still calm, but carrying an edge that made Sarah stop struggling and the bikers pause. "Let her go, settle your tab, and leave. Nobody needs to get hurt tonight." Snake Tattoo made the mistake of trying to look tough in front of his friends. He twisted Sarah's arm harder, making her cry out in pain. "What are you going to do about it, tough guy?" That sound, Sarah's cry of pain, was the final trigger. In Afghanistan, Connor had heard similar cries from civilians caught in the crossfire of violence. He promised himself that he would never stand by and watch the strong prey on the weak, whether in a war zone or a rooftop bar in Nashville. Connor's hand moved to his glass of whiskey, but not to take a drink. In his mind, he ran through his options. The glass could become a weapon, but that would risk serious injury. The bar stool could be used defensively. The space behind the bar would provide cover for Sarah once he got her clear. Years of Special Forces training had taught him to analyze and adapt to any situation in seconds. Tank must have sensed something changing in the atmosphere because he reached into his vest pocket. Connor knew there was probably a knife there. Men like Tank always carried one to make themselves feel tough. But Connor had faced much worse than a biker with a pocket knife. He'd stared down insurgents with automatic weapons, navigated minefields, and led his team through ambushes where the odds were far worse than 3-1. What the bikers didn't realize was that they had already made several critical mistakes. First, they had chosen to intimidate people weaker than themselves, marking themselves as bullies rather than real fighters. Second, they had failed to recognize the signs of a trained warrior in their midst. Connor's controlled breathing, his economical movements, the way his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings. But their biggest mistake was thinking that their numbers and size would guarantee them an easy victory. Sarah's eyes met Connor's for a brief moment, and he gave her a slight nod, a signal to be ready. He could see that she understood something was about to happen, and despite her fear, there was trust in her expression. She had recognized something in Connor that the bikers had missed. The quiet confidence of someone who had faced real danger and knew exactly how to handle himself. The tension in the air had reached its breaking point. Connor took one last slow breath, the same way he did before every combat operation. His muscles relaxed, his mind cleared, and time seemed to slow down even further. In that perfect moment of clarity, Staff Sergeant James Connor knew exactly what he needed to do. Connor's movement was so smooth that most people wouldn't have even noticed it. He lifted his whiskey glass and took one final sip, then set it down with a soft click on the wooden bar. That small sound somehow caught everyone's attention, like the tick of a clock just before midnight. "I said," Connor repeated, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect from hardened soldiers in combat zones. "Let her go." Each word was clear and precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Snake Tattoo's grip on Sarah's wrist tightened for a moment, then loosened slightly as uncertainty crept into his expression. Something in Connor's tone had finally gotten through to him, a warning that spoke of experience rather than empty threats. Tank, however, wasn't as perceptive as his friend. He took a heavy step forward, reaching into his vest pocket where Connor had already noted the outline of a knife. "You deaf, boy? Mind your own business before you get hurt." Connor stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He wasn't as big as Tank, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made the biker pause mid-step. It was the kind of confidence that couldn't be faked, the kind that came from facing real danger and winning. "Sarah is my business," Connor said calmly, using the bartender's name for the first time. "Everyone in this bar is my business. Just like those civilians in Kandahar were my business, and the villagers in Helmand province were my business. He took one step to the side, positioning himself perfectly between Sarah and the bikers. The mention of Afghan provinces made Tank's eyes narrow. For the first time, he seemed to really look at Connor, not just his civilian clothes, but his stance, his awareness, the way his eyes constantly tracked every movement in the room. Tank's hand hesitated at his pocket. Diesel, the third biker, had been trying to circle around behind Connor, but found himself strangely unable to get into position. Every time he moved, Connor shifted slightly, keeping all three men in his field of vision while maintaining his protective stance in front of Sarah. "You're making a big mistake," Tank growled, but there was a new note in his voice, something close to uncertainty. "There's three of us and one of you." Connor's lip twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "I've had worse odds. Last month, I had 12 insurgents with automatic weapons against just me and my spotter. Want to know how that turned out?" The way he said it, not as a boast but as a simple statement of fact, made Snake Tattoo's grip on Sarah's wrist finally loosen enough for her to pull free. She quickly moved behind Connor, rubbing her wrist where red marks showed where fingers had gripped too tight. Tank's hand finally came out of his pocket, and there was indeed a knife. A switchblade that probably looked impressive to drunk bar patrons but seemed almost toy-like compared to the combat knives Connor had trained with. "That's not a good idea," Connor said softly, his eyes locked on Tank's. "Because now you're not just looking at assault charges for grabbing Sarah. Now you're escalating to armed assault against a Special Forces operator. Do you really want to explain that to the police?" The mention of Special Forces made Diesel take a step back. Even Tank's confident facade cracked slightly. They had probably started the evening thinking they were the most dangerous men on the rooftop. Now they were facing someone who dealt with life-and-death situations for a living, someone who had been trained by the best military in the world to handle exactly this kind of situation. Connor's stance shifted almost imperceptibly, and suddenly the three bikers found themselves naturally backing away. They hadn't been pushed or threatened, but something in Connor's body language told their instincts that staying would be a very bad idea. "Your tab comes to $87, Sarah said from behind Connor, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger. "Pay it, and then leave. Now." The spell of intimidation that the bikers had cast over the rooftop was broken. Now they were just three men who had made a series of increasingly poor decisions, facing someone who had spent years learning how to deal with much more dangerous situations. The next few seconds would determine whether this confrontation ended with quiet words or violent action. Connor knew which outcome he preferred, but he was prepared for either. His body was relaxed but ready, his mind clear and focused, just like all those times in Afghanistan when everything had depended on the next few moments. Tank made his decision in the worst possible way, with more ego than sense. He lunged forward suddenly, the switchblade slashing through the air where Connor's chest had been just a split second before. But Connor wasn't there anymore. 6 years of Special Forces training had taught him to read body language like a book, and Tank's attack had been as obvious as a billboard sign. Connor stepped inside Tank's reach, moving with the smooth efficiency of someone who had practiced these movements thousands of times. His left hand caught Tank's knife hand at the wrist, while his right elbow came up in a short, sharp strike to the bigger man's solar plexus. The blow wasn't meant to hurt, just to shock the air from Tank's lungs and disrupt his balance. Snake Tattoo, trying to help his friend, grabbed a beer bottle from the bar and swung it wildly at Connor's head. But Connor had already anticipated this move. He shifted his weight, pulling Tank's substantial bulk into the path of Snake Tattoo's swing. The bottle crashed harmlessly against Tank's leather vest, sending glass and beer spraying across the wooden deck. "Stay back," Connor commanded Sarah, who had wisely retreated behind the solid wooden bar. His voice remained calm and controlled, even as he dealt with multiple attackers. This wasn't his first time handling a 3-on-1 situation, though usually his opponents had been carrying much more dangerous weapons than a switchblade and beer bottles. Diesel, the third biker, finally worked up his courage and charged forward like a bull. Connor used Tank's momentum to push him into Diesel's path, causing both men to stumble. In the same fluid motion, he twisted Tank's wrist, applying pressure to the nerve points that every Special Forces soldier learned in hand-to-hand combat training. The switchblade clattered to the floor. Snake Tattoo tried to circle around, looking for an opening. Connor kept moving, never staying still long enough to be surrounded. His footwork was precise and economical. No wasted movement, no dramatic spins or fancy kicks like in the movies. This was real combat training in action, where efficiency and effectiveness mattered more than style. Last chance to walk away, Connor offered, his breathing still steady and controlled. He wasn't showing off or trying to hurt anyone, just controlling the situation with the minimum force necessary. But Tank and his friends were too angry and embarrassed to take the wise option. Tank threw a wild haymaker punch, the kind that might work in a bar brawl against drunk opponents. Connor slipped the punch easily, stepping into Tank's space again. This time, he dropped his center of gravity and used Tank's own forward momentum to throw him off balance. The big biker went stumbling forward, crashing into a table and sending glasses flying. Snake Tattoo and Diesel tried to attack together, but their lack of training worked against them. They got in each other's way, neither wanting to be the first to face Connor directly. Connor used this hesitation to his advantage, keeping them off balance with quick, precise strikes to pressure points and nerve clusters, painful but not permanently damaging. A swift strike to Snake Tattoo's shoulder made his arm go temporarily numb, causing him to stumble backward in surprise. Diesel received a precise kick to the side of his knee, not hard enough to cause injury, but enough to make his leg buckle. Both men found themselves on the ground before they fully understood what had happened. Tank tried to get up for one last attack, but Connor had positioned himself perfectly. A quick sweep of Tank's legs sent the big man back down to the deck, this time with Connor's knee planted firmly but carefully in the center of his back. The whole fight had lasted less than 30 seconds. "The police are on their way," Sarah called from behind the bar, her phone in her hand. She had done exactly what she should have, stayed safe and called for help. Connor held Tank firmly but not cruelly, using pressure points and leverage rather than brute force. His breathing was still calm and measured. This wasn't like the intense firefights in Afghanistan. Those had been life or death struggles. This was more like a training exercise, using just enough force to control the situation without causing serious harm. Snake Tattoo and Diesel stayed on the ground, finally showing the good sense to realize that getting up would only make things worse. The sound of approaching sirens drifted up from the street below, and Connor knew the situation was almost over. He had protected the innocent without seriously hurting anyone, exactly as his special forces training had taught him. The rooftop bar had fallen completely silent except for the country music still playing softly through the speakers and the growing sound of police sirens from the street below. Connor kept Tank pinned firmly but carefully, making sure the big man couldn't cause any more trouble without actually hurting him. Snake Tattoo and Diesel remained on the ground, neither one willing to risk moving after seeing how quickly their leader had been taken down. Sarah stepped out from behind the bar, her hands still shaking slightly but her voice steady as she spoke into her phone. "Yes, officer, we're at the Highland Rooftop bar. 3 men started causing trouble and attacked a customer when he tried to help me. He has them under control now." She paused, listening. No serious injuries. Just some bruised egos." Connor allowed himself a small smile at that last comment. She wasn't wrong. The only real injuries here were to the biker's pride. He had made sure of that, using his training to control rather than harm. In Afghanistan, he'd had to make different choices, but here in Nashville, there was no need for anything more severe than some sore muscles and wounded pride. The elevator dinged, and 2 police officers stepped onto the rooftop, their hands resting cautiously on their holstered weapons. They took in the scene quickly. 3 bikers on the ground, a calm man in civilian clothes controlling the largest one, and a bartender who looked relieved to see them. "Evening, officers," Connor said professionally, not moving from his position. "Staff Sergeant James Connor, U.S. Army Special Forces. I have my military ID in my back pocket if you'd like to check it." His calm, professional tone and clear identification immediately set the officers at ease. They could tell they weren't dealing with a typical bar fight situation. The older of the 2 officers, whose nameplate read Martinez, approached while his partner kept watch. "What happened here, Sergeant?" Sarah spoke up first, holding her wrist where red marks were still visible. "These men were harassing customers all evening. When I tried to cut them off, this one grabbed me." She pointed to Snake Tattoo, who had the good sense to look ashamed. Sergeant Connor stepped in to help when they got violent. Officer Martinez nodded, taking notes as other officers began arriving on the scene. Connor explained the situation clearly and professionally, describing how Tank had pulled the switchblade and how he had been forced to subdue the three men using minimal force. He pointed out the knife on the ground where it had fallen, making sure not to disturb what was now evidence. The police were thorough but efficient, taking statements from Sarah and photographing her wrist where Snake Tattoo had grabbed her. They collected the switchblade as evidence and helped Tank and his friends to their feet, this time with handcuffs ensuring they wouldn't cause any more trouble. "You want to press charges, Sergeant?" Officer Martinez asked, his notebook ready. Connor looked at the three bikers, seeing not enemies, but just three men who had made poor choices. "That's up to Sarah," he said quietly. "They assaulted her, not me. I just helped resolve the situation." Sarah thought for a moment, then made her decision. "Yes, I want to press charges. Maybe some time in jail will teach them to treat people with respect." Her voice was firm, showing none of the fear from earlier. As the police led the bikers toward the elevator, Tank finally found his voice. "Hey, soldier," he called back, his tone surprisingly respectful. "Where'd you learn to fight like that?" Connor's response was simple and direct. "I learned from people who fight for real reasons, not to bully others. Think about that while you're sobering up in jail." The other customers who had fled earlier were starting to return, drawn by curiosity and the presence of police. They looked at Connor with a mixture of respect and gratitude, but he didn't acknowledge the attention. Instead, he began helping Sarah clean up the broken glass and righted the knocked-over furniture. "You don't have to do that," Sarah said softly, watching him collect scattered bottles and glasses. "Yes, I do," Connor replied with a small smile. "My sergeant major would have my hide if I left a mess, even one I didn't create." It was a small joke, but it helped break the tension of the evening. The police finished taking statements and photographs, and slowly the rooftop began to return to normal. But something had changed. There was a new respect in the way people looked at Connor, not because of his fighting skills, but because of how he had handled the entire situation with professionalism and restraint. After the police had left with Tank and his friends, the rooftop bar slowly came back to life. The evening breeze carried away the last traces of tension, and the soft country music once again became the main sound floating through the air. Several customers who had witnessed the incident from a safe distance now returned to their tables, trying not to stare too obviously at Connor. Sarah finished wiping down the bar where various drinks had spilled during the confrontation. She kept glancing at Connor, who was still helping straighten up chairs and tables, despite her protests that it wasn't necessary. Finally, she picked up a bottle of the Belle Meade Reserve bourbon and poured 2 fingers into a fresh glass. "This one's on the house," she said, sliding the glass toward Connor. "Actually, all your drinks tonight are on the house. It's the least I can do after everything." Connor shook his head politely and reached for his wallet. "That's not necessary. I didn't help because I wanted anything in return." He pulled out some cash, enough to cover his drinks plus a generous tip. "Besides, you probably lost some business tonight because of all this." The businessman who had left earlier when Tank knocked over his drink had returned. He approached Connor cautiously but with obvious respect. "Please, let me buy your drink, sir," he said, straightening his expensive tie. "What you did tonight, that was something special. We don't see enough people standing up for what's right these days." Connor looked at the man thoughtfully, then at Sarah, who was still nodding her agreement about the free drinks. He'd never been comfortable being the center of attention. In Afghanistan, he'd done his job quietly and professionally, never seeking recognition for the lives he'd saved or the missions he'd completed successfully. "Tell you what," Connor said, addressing both Sarah and the businessman. "Instead of free drinks, how about you both do something for me?" When they nodded eagerly, he continued, "Next time you see someone who needs help, step up. You don't have to fight. Sometimes just calling the police or speaking up is enough. But don't look away." Sarah touched her wrist where the red marks were already starting to fade. "I'll remember that," she said softly. "Though maybe I should also take some self-defense classes." "That's not a bad idea," Connor agreed. "But tonight, you did exactly the right thing. You stayed calm, called the police, and kept yourself safe. Sometimes that's the smartest way to handle things." The businessman grabbed a napkin and wrote something on it. "I'm a lawyer," he said, handing the napkin to Sarah. If you need help with the case against those guys, call my office. Pro bono, no charge, he turned to Connor. That goes for you too, Sergeant. Connor nodded his thanks but knew he probably wouldn't need a lawyer. His statement to the police had been clear and professional, and there were plenty of witnesses to verify that he'd used only necessary force to protect himself and others. A young couple, the same ones who had hurried out earlier when the bikers were making crude comments, approached their table. The young woman was holding her phone. Sir, she said hesitantly. Would you mind if we took a picture with you? Our friends are never going to believe what happened tonight. Connor politely declined the photo, but spent a few minutes chatting with the couple instead. He pointed out some simple ways they could stay safer in public places, being aware of their surroundings, knowing where the exits were, trusting their instincts about dangerous situations. They listened intently, clearly appreciating advice from someone who knew what he was talking about. As the night went on, more customers began filtering onto the rooftop. The story of what had happened spread quickly, growing more dramatic with each retelling. Connor heard snippets of conversations where the number of bikers somehow grew from 3 to 5, and their weapons became more dangerous with each version of the story. But Connor didn't bother correcting anyone. He knew the truth of what had happened, and more importantly, he knew why he'd done it. It wasn't about being a hero or teaching bullies a lesson. It was about doing what was right, just like he'd done countless times in combat zones halfway around the world. Later that night, Connor stood on the balcony of his hotel room, looking out over the Nashville skyline. The city lights sparkled against the dark sky, reminding him of the string lights from the rooftop bar. He had changed into more comfortable clothes, and the events of the evening played through his mind as he sipped a bottle of water. His phone buzzed with another message from his commanding officer back in Afghanistan. Word had somehow already gotten back to his unit about the incident at the Highland. Soldiers had a way of spreading stories faster than any official channels. The message was simple. Good work keeping your cool, Connor. Making us proud even on leave. Connor smiled slightly as he remembered his training days. His instructors had always emphasized that being a special forces operator wasn't just about fighting skills. It was about judgment, about knowing when to act and, more importantly, how much force to use. Tonight, he had put those lessons to good use. His thoughts drifted to Tank and his friends, now probably sitting in jail cells downtown. Connor didn't feel any anger toward them, just a kind of sadness. He had seen real warriors in Afghanistan, both American soldiers and local fighters who battled for their homes and families. Those men and women knew the true meaning of strength and courage. The bikers, with their patches and pretend toughness, were just playing at being dangerous. Sarah had texted him earlier, thanking him again and letting him know that several regular customers had already called the bar owner to praise how she handled the situation. She mentioned that the owner was planning to improve security and implement better protocols for dealing with troublesome customers. Something good had come from the night's events. The businessman's card sat on Connor's bedside table. He had taken it more out of politeness than necessity, but he appreciated the gesture. It reminded him of the locals in Afghanistan who would offer what little they had to soldiers who helped protect their villages. Kindness, Connor had learned, spoke the same language everywhere. A cool breeze carried the sound of distant music from Broadway's famous honky-tonks. Connor had originally planned to visit some of them during his leave, but now he wasn't sure. The quiet of his hotel room felt more appealing. In Afghanistan, he had learned to appreciate peaceful moments when they came. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his younger brother. Mom saw something on Facebook about you stopping some trouble at a bar. You okay? Connor shook his head, amazed at how fast news traveled. He typed back a quick response. All good. Tell Mom not to worry. Just helped someone who needed it. That was the simple truth of it. Despite all his training, despite all the complex combat scenarios he'd been through, tonight had been about the most basic principle he'd learned in the army: protect those who need protection. Whether it was civilians in a war zone or a bartender in Nashville, the duty remained the same. Connor walked back into his room and checked his gear out of habit, a soldier's ritual that had become second nature. His clothes were neatly folded, his ID and wallet secured, everything in its place. The discipline that had kept him alive in combat zones served him just as well in civilian life. Tomorrow, he would probably see his face in the local news or on social media. The story would spread, likely getting more exaggerated with each retelling. But Connor didn't care about that. He cared that Sarah was safe, that the bar could return to being a peaceful place for people to enjoy the Nashville skyline, and that maybe Tank and his friends would learn something from the experience. As he prepared for bed, Connor thought about his return to active duty next week. His leave hadn't turned out to be the quiet break he planned, but somehow that felt right. Being a soldier wasn't just a job you could turn on and off. It was part of who he was, whether in a combat zone or a rooftop bar in Tennessee. The night's events had reminded him why he had joined the Special Forces in the first place, not to learn how to fight, but to learn how to protect. Tonight, he had done exactly that, using his skills to defuse a situation with minimal harm to anyone. As he drifted off to sleep, Connor felt at peace with his actions, knowing he had lived up to the values his uniform represented, even while wearing civilian clothes.